I would like to welcome you to our event on faith and feminism. We have two very distinguished guests with us today, which I am happy to introduce to you. We have first Aruna Gnanadason. I've done my best. She's informed me that even in India, there are different ways to pronounce this name, so many of her fellow Indians also often don't get the pronunciation quite right. So I said, well, I'll be in good company then when I mispronounce it in front of our Camrosians here. Aruna comes to us from Chennai, India, where she is an activist who works on various issues related to equality, women's rights, the rights of all various sorts of persons, and also related to issues of the environment and economy. For 20 years, she worked in Geneva with the World Council of Churches, where she was director of the women's program for the council and also directed a number of other council initiatives. And she now, as I said, resides in her home, India, where she works with the United Church of South India. Our other guest is Zonneveld, who comes to us from California. She's originally from Malaysia, and she is the daughter of a Malaysian diplomat, so she lived in a number of different international locales. Also has some similarities to the namesake of the center, right, Chester Ronning, who served as a diplomat for Canada. Ani is the founder of Muslims for Progressive Values, which is an activist organization that focuses on issues of equality, women's rights, LGBTQ rights, and various other issues related to compassion and social justice. And they are an international organization that has done work all over the world. I should also mention, before she started working as an activist, she was a musician for 25 years, and is probably the only Ronning Center guest I will ever introduce who has won a Grammy Award. So it's not something you'll likely hear again from my mouth at the Ronning Center event, but we are certainly excited to have both of them here today. Before we get started and I introduce kind of what we're planning to do here, I'd like to also thank the World Student Christian Federation of North America and St. Joseph's College at the North Campus of the University of Alberta. They are jointly hosting a conference this weekend on faith and feminism, and they were instrumental in bringing Aruna and Ani here to Alberta. So after they give their talks here, they'll be jetting, not literally jetting, driving up to Edmonton to take part in that conference. So I'd like to recognize St. Joe's and the Student Christian Federation as well. Of course, I would like to acknowledge that the land on which we gather is Treaty 6 territory and a traditional meeting ground for many Indigenous peoples. The territory on which the Augustana campus of the University of Alberta is located provided a traveling route and home to the Cree, Blackfoot, and Métis, as it did for the Nakota, Tsuut'ina, Chipewyan, and other Indigenous peoples. Their spiritual and practical relationships to the land create a rich heritage for our learning and our life as a community. So what I've asked Aruna and Ani to do today is first for each of them to spend a little bit of time talking about what feminism means and has meant to them from their individual perspectives. So I've asked them to focus on their current locale, but as I've said, both of them have lived in a number of international locales, have worked all over the globe. So I'd like for each of them to share their perspective from where they're at and where they're coming from, but also to contextualize that some globally. Right? What are the challenges that feminism, whatever that means to them within their particular tradition, what are the challenges that they face in their tradition, in their locale, but then also how does that, how would they contextualize that globally within their faith traditions, within Christianity for Aruna and within Islam for Ani. Then I've asked them to respond to one another, to have a little bit of dialogue, right? To comment on what they see as similarities between their different contexts, what they see as differences between their different contexts. And then also we'll have time, of course, for you all to enter the discussion, to ask them questions you might have, and to make it not just a dialogue, but a conversation amongst us and everyone here. So we decided that Aruna would go first. So Aruna, take the stage.
Thank you very much, Ian, for that welcome and for the introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here. I was in the middle of the Global Institute of Theology in Hanover when this invitation came to me. And at that moment, all I wanted to do was to curl up and sleep somewhere, not be jetting off 21 hours in the air to get here. But I did take it on because of what I was going to be doing here. I think it's very important for us to speak along with Muslim women about what feminism can offer to the world. So I was thrilled that I'll be sharing the platform with a female imam, which you didn't say. It's very important in my context to be saying that Annie is a female imam is quite special. In India, we don't have any. In India, only a very few, the word feminist is not a very good word in India. Not many people identify themselves as feminists because it is portrayed by the media and patriarchal forces in the country as something which comes from the West and which does not fit with our cultural milieu. But a few of us women who have been active in the struggles of women in the country have appropriated the term feminist. I'm proud to say I'm an Indian feminist because we see feminism offering an alternative paradigm for the terrible world in which we are living. We are living in a world, feminism has led me to ask new questions and seek new answers for all the mess that the world is in. You see around us the atmosphere of fear, of want, of war, and reckless destruction of people and the earth, and which is tearing into our lives, our existence itself. So feminism offers a new political imagination. It offers an overarching paradigm and blueprint for change and propels all of us, men and women, to critical engagement with struggles for rights and identity of those pushed to the margins because of their gender, their race, their caste, economic and political status, their sexuality and sexual preferences. Feminism has made me aware not only of the human cost of systems of injustice, but of the cost to the earth and to all those who struggle to protect the earth, particularly indigenous peoples all over the world. So feminism is not a prerogative of women alone. It belongs to every person who wants to see radical transformative love in action in the world. As a prominent feminist in India, Hindu feminist says, all radical political activists and theorists, then necessarily also must be feminist. That is her opinion. Secondly, I would like to say that there is no one definition of feminism. Feminism of different religious groups and sectors of Indian society protest the way in which they are often perceived by the mainline feminist movements. Sometimes the many forms of feminisms that exist in the third world are not easily recognized as feminists. I have been asked, how can you be a feminist when you wear a sari? I've actually been asked that question. So hijab or sari-clad feminists do not seem to fit the normal definitions or understanding of who a feminist is. Our questions, as well as our methodologies for achieving liberation, are different. And this fact sometimes makes our brand of feminist consciousness unrecognizable within the framework of dominant feminist theory. We have to acknowledge the existence of many feminisms in our world, all pioneered by women, passionately committed to justice and dignity for women and all people. Laura Donaldson, the American writer, says that she sees a potential for violence within feminist criticisms and denial of diverse experiences and genders of the global community of women. And she feels it threatens the continued viability of feminism as a revolutionary movement. So we really need to come together more as women to identify what is it that really binds us all together. Secondly, my faith. I grew up as a fourth-generation Christian in a home where faith was closely linked to the rituals of Christian life, going to church Sunday, reading the Bible every day, faithful attendance to all the rituals of the church. But thankfully, it was a home where I was also taught the Bible stories. But my grandmother was not a liberation theologian. She just taught the stories. But that type of a Christianity gave me an understanding and passion for Christian service and charity. It was indeed a story that she told us of a liberator God and Jesus Christ. As one of the first women doctors in India, she made us proud to be Christian. And she told us that we, as a small minority of Christians in India, must be proud of who we are and proclaim that clearly. There was some years when I strayed away from the church and my grandmother's message after she died. I felt it was time for me to move away from that and got more involved in political engagement for change. But then I came back to Christianity, first through the student Christian movement, where I learned that the Bible is in fact a pretty political document. It taught me what social justice was. It gave me a completely new understanding of the Bible story. And second, through feminist theology, which taught me that there is so much more to our faith and resources of our faith that can give us hope, can lead us forward, and can give us the meat we require for a political agenda for change. And it also made me recognize, one, that I am an Indian feminist theologian, and that there's something special about the Indian in that name, and that the most important thing is that I work with other subaltern communities like women, other subaltern communities like indigenous peoples, Dalits in India, as well as LGBTQI persons, and that together only we can bring change. So there are these two key aspects in my life, feminism and faith, and they have held me together and have, I know that we live in a world where we have a God who holds the world in her loving hands, protects us, and ensures justice for all. No one is excluded. I have been deeply influenced, as I said, that by feminist theologians who have given me so much of an understanding of partnership, of community, of alternative ways of living and believing in the power of God. It has provided me the resources to boldly explore my own context and what it means to be an Indian Christian feminist. And that there is such a powerful liberation potential in my faith. While feminist theology did grow out of a commitment of an advocacy for women's rights, it is very clear that when you read feminist theologians the best of them, they clearly make it clear that we cannot speak of women as if they're a category somewhere out there, that they're part of society. It's not about pitting men against women or anything like that. It's about recognizing the Christian message in the life of our societies, our peoples, and particularly in the focus to bring change. So the language they would use, for instance, as Letty Russell, for instance, says that we move away from a pyramid of domination, which is the world. We see it in India. I live in one of the most patriarchal societies in the world, where there is such a strong sense of who's on the top and who's right underneath. And of course, women who are Dalits would be the dust of the dust, as one of their leaders described it. So we cannot live in such a world. We need to break these pyramids of power and create circles of love and friendship and solidarity. That's the only hope for our world. So feminism has given me that courage and belief that it is possible, that it is not impossible to even challenge autocratic rulers like a guy who's very close to you, Trump, and another guy who's very close to me, who is our Prime Minister, Modi. We call them twins, by the way, Modi and Trump. But another thing has been very important, which feminism has taught me. It's given me the courage to question my own faith, to challenge my own faith for its patriarchal biases, for its inherited colonial theology, which is what we are taught as Indians, and to also challenge extremism in my own faith. Those who are taking all those terrible steps. What's happening in the US is a classic example of what Christianity should not do, and what is the danger if the rest of us keep silent of what Christianity has potential to do. And all this has come to me out of my reading of feminist theology, which has taught me to be very critical of the patriarchal biases in Christianity. I believe that the urgent task, therefore, is to forefront the liberation potential of my faith and all our faiths. Along with Letty Russell, I would assert that those of us who fall in faith, as she puts it, with this man, Jesus, and his story of God's welcome, experience a cognitive dissonance, a contradiction between ideas and actual experience. When we turn from reading the Gospels and looking at the way this message has been interpreted by the church through the ages. Nevertheless, many of us continue to find that this is a life-giving story that points us to God's intention for the new creation in our lives and society, etc. So this impels us, me, to seek alliances with other progressive movements, people's movements struggling for dignity, for rights, for those who are excluded and discriminated against. Solidarity, in my opinion, is a very good theological and political word that we ought to reclaim and live by. And finally, I would say that I live in a country where both Christian and Muslim women face many forms of patriarchal violence and exclusion in the family, in society, and even from the state. We have just now a Hindu nationalist government which does little to protect the minorities, the largest being Muslims, who form 15% of our population, and then Christians, who form 3% of our population. From what women wear, to food habits, to personal laws, to languages and forms of worship, there are controls, not only in India, but all over the world. And we, as children of this liberator God, cannot accept those sort of controls on our lives. So we live in a climate of fear evoked by powerful political forces and by religious authorities that are fully aware that where communities live in fear, there will be little resistance to injustice. So creating a climate of fear is their agenda, so that we will not resist. We will cow down in fear, and that's what is happening to most of us. Refusing to fear is a powerful political tool. We need to refuse to cow down before those who fan these flames of fear by creating a hierarchy of suffering, encouraging us to divide ourselves. We need to talk about the intersection between our struggles into the way in which we will stand firmly together. When one person lives in fear, be it in the US Army, or a shady prostitute den in Manila, or a camp follower of a militant group in the Democratic Republic of Congo, or a Muslim living in fear because he or she is caught with beef in a slum in Hyderabad in India. Wherever people live in fear, it becomes our struggle, our responsibility to speak out and act. Let us explore creative ways to do it. Thank you.
We'll go ahead and move right along and have Ani share with us before we open up for some dialogue.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm going to go through a laundry list of values, and then I'm going to ask you to define what they are. The right to work outside the home. For women, the right to work outside the home. The right for women to keep the earnings for herself. The right for a woman to decide who and when she marries. The right to inheritance. The right to education. The right to self-determination. What sort of values are these? Feminist values. These are values that are founded in the Quran 1400 years ago, believe it or not. These are values that Prophet Muhammad advocated for women 1400 years ago. And yet, 1400 years later, we are still fighting for those same very basic rights. So that goes to show how pathetic the practice of Islam is by Muslims. Now this is very important, the way I'm phrasing it. The phrasing is the practice of Islam by Muslims. It's not the practice of Islam itself, it's the practicing of that interpretation that is the bastardized version of Islam. So I'm going to go through some definitions first to give the context of how the Quran has advocated for these values 1400 years ago and how we are here today still fighting for those basic rights. You hear a lot in the media and by religious leaders, Muslim religious leaders, about Sharia law, and we all think that it's God's law. So there's two concepts here. The first concept is Sharia. Sharia is basically a set of, it's defined in the Quran as the watering hole that quenches your spiritual thirst. It's very beautiful poetry. And basically it's a set of guidelines of how one should live one's life ethically, kindly to one another as human beings towards each other, regardless of what tribe and what religion you are. Kindness towards animals, kindness towards the environment, protecting the environment. So it's very clear in the Quran that human beings are the protector or the guardians of the environment. But that's obviously not how we have conducted ourselves as human beings. So that's Sharia. It's not a set of laws, a set of guidelines. But how did it become law? That's the best part. So now you have, if you went back to Prophet Muhammad's days and you asked them, hey, what do you think of this Sharia law about women or girls forced into marriage? It's Sharia law. And they're going to look at you like you're an alien because that did not exist at the founding of Islam 1400 years ago. So what has happened is, after Prophet Muhammad died, all these religious leaders, or those who claim to be religious leaders and politicians, have used their extrapolation of the Quran, their understanding of the Quran. Now, mind you, they are medieval politicians, misogynistic, homophobic, oppressive, right? They're not exactly egalitarian types. So they're going to read the Quran from their understanding of it, and these political leaders have meshed it up with cultural norms, such as child marriage, such as slavery, and all these social norms that are contradictory to the Quran itself. And then they put it all together and they go to the religious imam or theologian that is on their payroll. Go ahead and give it your religious stamp. And if you don't, off with your head. Right? Because that's what they do. And that's what ISIS does. And that's what Saudi Arabia does. And that's what Iran does. Okay? So now you have yourself a religiously stamped Sharia law. So this is not God's law. It's a man's extrapolation of God's law. So it's a man-made law, 100%. There's nothing godly about it. So that's why, and Sharia law is different in different parts of the Muslim world. Yeah? It's different in Saudi Arabia, it's different in Malaysia, it's different in Aceh, in a small island, in a small province of Indonesia, etc., etc. If it's really God's law, why is it every few years when I go back to Malaysia, the Sharia law, when it comes to women's rights in marriage and inheritance and in divorce, changes every 3 years? I have this heated argument with my sister all the time, who's an Islamic theologian, but who was graduated of Azhar University, which is a renowned Sunni institution. And so she can't argue back because, well, did God come and reveal a new set of laws for Malaysia? You know, but no, it's totally a man-made set of laws. So those are the two very different concepts. That is really important to understand how what we have in the Quran 1400 years ago is very different in how it's being practiced in the 21st century. What we've seen throughout the century is the delegitimization of the women's role in Islam. It was mentioned that I'm an imam, and we get a lot of pushback. How is it that a Muslim woman is leading man and women in prayer, congregation in prayer, unsegregated? Because, well, the first female imam was appointed by Prophet Muhammad. So why is it that we've never had all these female imams that is the norm? That should be the norm as men leading prayer. So that's the feminist streak that we, as Muslims for Progressive Values, as the organization, we've taken the sacred text, we've dusted off a lot of the misogynistic interpretations of Islam. There are plenty of books out there by scholars of Islam, men and women, looking at the Quran from a more gender-neutral and more holistic prism of reading the Quran and interpreting it that way. So those are the contexts from which we practice our Islam, from which we advocate our Islam. It's not necessarily feminist in itself, but it is definitely egalitarian. As a Muslim woman imam, what we don't do is to define that, well, in our community, only Muslim women lead prayer. That would just be matriarchy. That's no better than patriarchy. So we actually take turns. If I lead the prayer, then the man will do the call for prayer. If I do the call for prayer, then the man will lead prayer. So we take turns. We encourage every individual in our community to take spiritual leadership. So this is what makes our community very different. The politicization of Islam, of religion, and infusing it into politics has been the result of the mayhem that we see in the Muslim world. When you look at hudud, which is this punishment of stoning for adultery in the name of Sharia law, it actually doesn't exist in the Quran. It's shocking. So we're actually having laws, Sharia law, about stoning those for adultery, That's not even in the Quran, and most of the time it's the woman that gets stoned and not the men, because the woman gets pregnant. You had extramarital sex, you're pregnant. But she's not Mary, right? That's not an immaculate conception. So where's the man? So those are the contradictions of what is really in the Quran and what is actually in practice. Another example is marriage has been two consenting adults of sound mind. That is what the Quran dictates. And yet, in many Muslim countries and societies, even in the West, you have female, young women, 13, as soon as puberty hits, they are forced into marriage. Now, marriage in Islam is a contract. It's between the woman and the adult man, the adult woman, adult man. And you have to be adult because marriage is about negotiating a contract. So the Quran is very clear. When you marry Muslim women, to protect Muslim women, you have to negotiate what is called a marriage contract. Most Muslim women don't even know they have these rights because we were not taught. Because that is the way the religious leaders have oppressed us by keeping us uninformed, by keeping our societies uninformed, by not teaching the truth, basically. And so, in order for you as an individual to negotiate a contract for yourself, hey, you know what? I have the right to go visit my mother on her birthday, and I have the right to visit, to work outside the home because the Quran gives me those rights, etc., etc. Those are conditions that you put on paper when you marry. So that is a marriage contract that is dictated in the Quran for Muslim women. But that's not what we have. What we have is, and also when you marry, the man gives the woman a marriage gift, which you keep for yourself, that the family of the woman does not take. But what has happened, for example, in the refugee camps, Syrian refugee camps in Jordan, you see a lot of young girls being forced into marriage to rich suitors from the Gulf states. So they come and they will marry the 13-year-old against her will. The parents take the money because it's one extra mouth they don't have to feed. And the fact that the parents take the money in itself is the false practice of Islam, because it's the girl that's supposed to keep that gift. So it's no different than selling your child, right? There's no difference. And what happens is this rich suitor will shack up for a month or two with his young bride, and then she gets pregnant, what have you, and then he goes back to his family, his first wife, right? And so here you have a young woman, a teenager, pregnant, and basically ostracized from society. This is what's happening in the Muslim world. So these are the issues that we highlight. These are the issues where we call out those corrupt religious leaders, because who's this imam that actually married this young girl against her will to the rich suitor? He should have known better as a religious leader, supposedly, right? So we address the issues back to the corruption, the moral corruption of the religious leaders themselves. That's what we do as a Muslim organization. For us, we do not see a difference between Western feminism, because like I gave you the whole laundry list of values, that's as feminist as they get. It was those feminist values before the term feminism existed 1400 years ago. So for the Western feminists to accuse me of, well, you cannot use Islam. Why do you use Islam? I mean, I've gotten ostracized and called out by some of the Western feminists for using my faith to push back against the misogynistic interpretation of Islam for women and girls' rights. And I find this really a contradiction, because feminism is about empowering your identity and egalitarianism, no matter what that is. And so what I find that there is a very strong bias of Western feminists against Muslim feminists itself. So we need our house in order in that regard. I'm going to go through a few hot subject matters that I'm sure people know about, that would, the issue of guardianship in Islam. And, the Saudi women are finally allowed to drive starting next year, yippee. But the thing is, Saudi women, Islam was born in the peninsula of Saudi Arabia, but they were driving camels just as the men were. So This whole notion of controlling women's self-determination in Saudi Arabia, I beg you to not look at Saudi Arabia as exemplary or as the marker of what Islam stands for. As Muslims for Progressive Values, we look at Saudi Arabia as the nemesis, the antithesis of what Islam is, actually. Everything they do is the opposite of what the Quran said. Let's start from there. So, when you have this term guardianship in the Quran, what is the meaning of guardian? A guardian is someone who cares for you, someone who lifts you up, someone who helps you fly, and fly in the right direction. It's not an oppressor, right? That's what a guardian means. It's not the meaning of being an oppressor. And yet, in real life, in many of the Muslim girls and women's lives, in more of the traditional communities, that is exactly how the term guardian is being practiced. It's more of an oppressive characteristic than one of a helper, a true guardian. Now, the infamous verse 434, the wife beating verse, as it's infamously known. The word is daraba, and actually that word has many meanings, 12 to 17 meanings, depending on who you talk to. And the one that is being translated and that's been sold to us for centuries is that it means that the husband has the right to beat your wife if the wife is disobedient. But actually it also means to walk away. And so when all the conservative Muslim imams and traditionalists say, well, it means that the husband has the right to beat the wife lightly, and they always claim to emulate Prophet Muhammad's behavior and his kindness and his dressing, the length of his beard, they do all that, right? But when it comes to this, they don't. And what happened when Prophet Muhammad was in a major row with one of his wife, he actually walked away. He left the house and walked away and stayed away for a month. And that's the other meaning of daraba, is to walk away, to separate yourself, cool down, time out, right? But that's not what we were taught. So there's a whole slew of misinterpretation when inheritance is a big issue that's been debated in Tunisia and in Morocco, where inheritance was given more to men, primarily because men at 1400 years ago were the sole breadwinner for the most part. And women did not have to take care of the family because, after all, if they did work, they were allowed to keep the money, their earnings, for themselves. They did not have to share with the rest of the family, their husband. But in the 21st century, you can't survive on one income. So in Morocco, 20% of Muslim women there actually are the sole breadwinners, and they should receive at least 50% of the inheritance, but they're not. So that's where the debate is starting, because society in the 21st century is very different than it was 1400 years ago. We live less so in a tribal society than we did 1400 years ago. So there's a whole slew of adapting, of updating, revisiting many of these interpretations that have been done so misogynistically, that has become truth, that needs to be revisited, that has been challenged. And what's really beautiful in the work that we do is that we have many scholars of Islam and also human rights defender in the Muslim world that use Islamic human rights language in the same vein that we do. And with this partnership that we have all over the world, it makes our work a lot easier, but it also, with the Quran giving us the context, the sociological context, the anthropological context, it helps us navigate through the landmines. It helps us challenge the many Muslim majority countries at the United Nations when they justify their human rights abuses in the name of Islam. We can go in there and challenge them on those very wordings, and which undermines, it pulls the rugs from underneath them. One of the works that I'm very proud of is our Imams for She work, and that is, we borrowed from the UN He for She initiative, and where we work with scholars of Islam, men and women, and we work with male imams in the traditional societies where these imams actually advocate for women and girls' rights in the context of Islam. And we work in Burundi, in Tunisia, and Malaysia. And that is basically the full generalized context of feminism and Islam, faith and feminism. And my personal journey, to go circle back, is from my personal experience after relearning Islam for myself after 9/11. I created an Islamic pop CD because I realized that a lot of Americans didn't know what Islam is and what Muslim should be and ought to be and sounded like, and all they knew was no information and then terrorists, right? So I thought, well, here's a different perspective, a Muslim woman without the hijab in a musical form, educating about feminism in Islam or an egalitarian interpretation of Islam. So being the songwriter producer, I said, well, the least I could do for the American society was to do an Islamic pop CD based on my new knowledge of Islam that was egalitarian and feministic and in its interpretation. And lo and behold, what I found out in 2004 in the United States, that none of the Muslim retail stores would actually sell my CD because I was a female singer and the female voice was supposed to be covered. That's a new one for me, and I'm born and raised Muslim. And number two, because I used all the musical instrumentation, that was also haram, forbidden, because during Prophet Muhammad's time, he only had percussion. But they can use computers now, that's okay, right? So at that point, I said there's no way in hell was I going to put up with this. And that's this sort of stifling of a woman's voice was really the impetus for me to found this organization, Muslims for Progressive Values, with many other like-minded Muslims in America. We did it for American Muslims in 2004, and it became, it was registered as a nonprofit in 2007, not realizing that there were a lot of other Muslims in the Muslim world that also shared our values. And so that's why we've ended up going global. So that's my full circle of being born, raised Muslim, and becoming a feminist, a Muslim feminist, and the activist that I've become. Thanks.
Aruna, you had mentioned in your talk, and then Ani also alluded to this too, that there are many different types of feminism. And as an academic, right, especially in the West, we get caught up in these debates about different waves of feminism and how do we define the concept of feminism. Hearing both of you speak, I imagine that in your work, your day-to-day activism and work, that these debates have to be kind of set aside, and you just have to do what you have to do. But nonetheless, I'd love to hear you, just now that you've each heard each other speak, comment some on how maybe you see points of contact and similarities between each of your roles as a feminist, how you position yourselves as feminists in your traditions, but also maybe some differences, right? You commented on the fact that there are many different feminisms, and so this concept, this active role in your societies has played out.
Let me think. I always start a lecture, whether I'm speaking to a church women's group or a group of feminist thinkers, that I am a feminist. Because it's very important for them to see that a feminist is not some sort of a terror, a bra burning, the images that the media had projected. And that's come straight into India, into the conscience of men. And so they keep saying, but why should you call yourself a feminist? Call yourself use some other Indian nomenclature for the same idea. And I am insisting that I'm an Indian feminist, because all those attempts are to silence us, basically, to tone us down, so to speak. I see the differences in understandings of feminism, because, for instance, in India we have a group of people called the Dalits. They are in the Hindu caste hierarchy. These are people who were thrown out because they're supposed to be polluting. And there's a whole movement of Dalit young women now, asserting their right to existence, asserting their Dalit identity, and refusing to hide behind that identity as they did for very long. Maybe, Ani, you should talk a little bit of what you said of being, what did you call yourself, a closeted Muslim. I think it's interesting for you to share that story, because so many women hide their identity. And there are occasions when I don't say I'm a feminist, because I may just be turning off a whole group of people in India if I use that expression. But I try my best in every situation to use it. So I have to be very careful that I'm not judgmental of another woman who is struggling, who's deep in the struggle for dignity, for rights. For instance, the Dalit women, who don't want to use the word feminist because they see that as something which is the upper caste women in India. They see us using it and they feel that they don't want to take it on. So the importance here, of course, is not to say I'm a feminist and therefore I'm a little better than you, but to understand that women are coming from various points of view, lives, experiences, and how we can build this unity together, and perhaps persuade them about the values of feminism, as Annie said, more than the word. It is immaterial, what we call ourselves, on condition we live up to the values that it holds. And that also men feel engaged in this movement, because that's been one of the dangers. I have seen it in the US when literally a feminist theologian who I won't name, to a big hall of us, suddenly she stopped her lecture and said, all men can leave the room. And for me, I was shocked and angry with her for doing that, because that goes against the grain of any feminist value. So we live with these contradictions, but I see feminism not as something that I own. It's for everybody to own. We need an alternative political paradigm. Everything that has been tried is not working. And you see, now we're coming full circle back into a capitalist language in our world. So we need political wisdom on how we are going to change things in this country, in this world. And I encourage us to see whether feminism can offer that alternative for creating a new political paradigm.
So, the feminists are often or falsely labeled as hater of men, but I love men, so, but I'm a feminist, so there you go, that defines that theory, right? So Aruna mentioned about me being a closeted Muslim. When I was in the music business, I was pretty much a closeted Muslim. I never disclosed that I was a Muslim. It was a private matter for me. And I understand how stifling and unhealthy way of living that is, whatever your identity is, LGBT included. So maybe that is one, probably as someone who was closeted in my Muslim identity, that coming out was very liberating for me, number one. Number two, it is the framing of the work that we do as myself as a feminist, but as an organization, is one of inclusivity. It's not to better a woman's position or a girl's position at the expense of someone else. We have to look at this. We are all one society, men, women, straight, trans, everything in between. The environment, it has to be holistic. It has to benefit everyone. It has to be a win-win. So that's the way I look at feminism. And I do identify myself as a Muslim feminist, but I think this is very important because it does shatter a lot of the the falsehood of what a Muslim woman should be, sound like, think, so whatever I can do to shatter that stereotype, I will. And the fact that I also lead prayer and officiate weddings, that is another expression of that feminism. I didn't aspire to be an imam, but I fell into it as a result of the needs of our own communities, so that's where it's taken. I want to add one little note. In the Quran, God, in the translation of the Quran, it's always the word God or Allah is, the pronoun of God is He, and that is so in Christianity as well, and many different faiths. But what's really interesting is in just about every, except for one verse of the Quran, it starts with Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, and the word Rahim, and the word that this phrase means in the name of God, the most compassionate, the merciful. And the word Rahim, the root word is womb. Okay? So if God is so compassionate and merciful, and the character is rooted in the word womb, because the womb is really the most protective, nurturing environment ever, right? This is the character of God, so it's not really all that male.
I rarely get to chime in with knowledge from my Hebrew Bible scholarship, but I can also add that in the book of Isaiah, similar language, and the Hebrew cognate, or there's a Hebrew cognate to the Arabic that's similar, and similar language related to the womb is used in the book of Isaiah to refer to God's nature as well. So, yeah. We have plenty of time, but perhaps I have other questions I could ask, but I'm sure that some of you have comments, questions that you have for Aruna and Nani. So maybe I'll open it up, and if others have points that they would like to hear commentary on, or questions that you have for our guests.
I'm still a little bit confused between Islam and Muslim. Is Islamic doctrinal theology, and Muslim is like the practice or the community?
So the question So the question is the difference between Islam and Muslim. So Islam would be Christianity, and Muslim would be Christians. That's it. So how you as a Christian practice your Christianity depends on your denomination. So it's the same with Muslims, depending on their denomination and their interpretation. Yeah? Is that clear?
Sort of. In Christianity, the denominations are very clear. We have names for the different denominations, and we represent very different practices.
Yes.
Is that so in the Muslim world?
Yes, so the question was, in Christianity you have very clear denominations and the teachings and so on. It's the same in the Muslim world. So you have the Sunni, which is one branch, and you have the Shia as one other branch, a major branch, and you have Ahmadiyya, which is a newer branch. And within these three denominations, you have sub-denominations as well.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Joyce.
Where do the Ismailis fit in?
Where do the Ismailis fit in? They fit in, they're a minority group within the Shia. Yeah, which is, I think about 10 to 15% total of the Muslim population.
Jordy, I see your hand back.
I have a question on a very controversial topic of feminism and theology. I'm curious to elaborate on the difference of a Muslim woman who is liberated of one who's more outwardly would seem progressive without wearing hijab, compared to a woman who would wear a niqab or chador and feel liberated as well as a woman and confident in her Muslim identity. If you could maybe talk a bit about that.
Right, so I've met a lot of Muslim women who wear hijabs who are just as liberal as I am. And I've met Muslim women who wear sleeveless and miniskirts, but who are not feminists in their worldview at all. They're actually homophobic and prejudiced in various ways. So I would not judge someone's clothing I would not judge someone's thinking based on their clothing necessarily, although those that do wear, it depends what part of the world, right? Because I said this yesterday at dinner, is that the Muslim women who in the Muslim world are really peeved off at some of the Muslim here in the West who wear hijabs, for example, and niqabs, and defend it as a choice. Because in the Muslim world, it's not a choice. You have no choice. As a matter of fact, there's a very strong strand and theologians who basically, even like the ex-mufti of Al-Azhar made a claim last year or a year and a half ago that Muslim women who don't wear hijabs are apostates, which is really calling for violence for Muslim women who don't wear a head covering. And we can talk about hijab if you want. Yeah? Okay. All right, so the only time the word hijab is mentioned in the Quran is once, and it means wooden covering. Okay, it's not a scarf. So that context, so Prophet Muhammad home dwelling is basically where the Muslim community in Medina prayed. That's where travelers would stop by, and he would house them, shelter them, feed them, and etc. until they found their own permanent housing. And so there were a lot of strangers in and out of his home. So there was no privacy between his public stature and his private quarters. And so then the Quran was revealed that there was a story in the Quran about how these strangers would never leave his home. They would just stay there. And so it became a privacy issue. And so it was advised in the Quran that if you want to speak to the Prophet's wives, you should speak through a wooden screen. And that's the hijab. In another verse somewhere else, it talks about being modest. Being modest is basically covering your bosom. Now, here's the interesting part. During that time, 1400 years ago, whether you were not allowed to cover, you were not allowed to cover unless you were of a particular elite status. Yeah? It's similar to Byzantine, the Persian customs, and the Christian customs later on, where how much you covered was a status symbol. Right? Because the fairer you were meant you didn't have to work the fields, because if you were covered the way you were, you could not work the fields. So it had a lot to do with this sociology, social status, and it's very anthropological in its context. So the Quran revealed that to be modest is basically to cover your bosom, because women actually went bare-chested. That was normal. So. And then it goes on to say that men and women should be modest, not just in how they cover themselves, but in how they carry themselves, in their speech, in their mannerisms. So that's what modesty really means. But that context of being modest, of covering your chest, has now ended up covering your hair, covering your face. So all that has no real context in theology. And it has become more of a cultural practice. So like I said, throughout the centuries, you had all these men basically dictating Islam based on their misogynistic and puritanical, whatever do you want to define it, prism of Islam. And so over the century, what has ended up is that women were first encouraged to dress like the Prophet's wives. That means they had to cover themselves, because Prophet's wives it was said that they covered themselves to identify themselves as Prophet's wives, so they would not get harassed, especially when they went out at night to relieve themselves. And so what has happened throughout the centuries is now it's become, instead of you are encouraged to cover yourself, to follow the example of Prophet Muhammad, you are now told that this is a religious mandate. So now we have the 21st century version of being modest. That's it.
I was going to ask Aruna if you wanted to comment at all on that from the Indian perspective. of course, you have many Muslim friends in India, but also in relation to traditional indigenous Indian dress and Christianity, right? You mentioned that you have had outsider Western feminists point at you and say, how can you call yourself a feminist and wear a sari, or a Christian feminist? And, right, so I'm wondering if you could follow up.
Like the example she gave, even in India, in one part of India, particularly in Kerala, women went bare-breasted. And the missionaries came from Victorian England to India, and they were shocked to see these women with their breasts bare.
Hanging.
And therefore, they forced women to cover their breasts, to wear a top. So this was something which Christian missionaries brought to India, to those people. Now, of course, we are happy that we are able to cover our breasts, because we live in societies where men can harass us even when we are fully clothed. So we are not safe. So it's better that we are not walking around with our breasts hanging, because we could face problems. But I also, and now I have noticed, I have been away from India for 20 years when I was in Geneva. And when I came back, I noticed that in the churches, more and more women are covering their head. When I went to Geneva in my congregation, which is an English-speaking congregation, most of us didn't cover our heads when we went into church. But now, everyone is pulling out a small piece of cloth, an ugly-looking cloth, and putting it on their heads when they go forward for communion. So it's sort of a pressure coming from the pulpit very often, by the way, to tell women you have to be modest. You must cover your head in the presence of God. So it's happening not only to Muslims, it's happening to all of us. This sort of pressure on us to dress properly, and women improperly dressed will not be allowed into this church. I have read it in several churches around the world. So who is determining who is properly dressed and who is improperly dressed? So these are realities we have to live with. And the second, and I agree with Annie on one thing, that more and more Muslim women are wearing the hijab than they did in the past in India. Definitely, there are more of them. Now, I work with a group of feminist activists, Muslim women in India, who are doing wonders. They walked into a dargah. They just went in. They were stopped several times, but they pretended they didn't see the people stopping them and just walked in. They're trying to prove a point that the holy places are not the preserve of men, that they have a right to be there. Who knows, we may even have a woman imam one of these days. And they have managed to change the law recently on this triple talaq. If a man just said talaq, 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 he's divorced his wife. He could text her, talaq, 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 and that was counted legally as a divorce. So women went to the courts and they have won their case, that no longer can a divorce be on the basis of they have to go through all the procedures before they divorce a wife. Now these are women who are fighting these things, and most of them, I have met this group of women, are in the hijab. They have no problem. They are feminists, they are fighting, they are walking into mosques where they don't belong in the hijab. So in a way, what they are saying is, this attention on the hijab is a Western agenda. We don't care. We are more interested in the whole of our lives as Muslim women. And our lives are not only about what we wear. It's how we are treated by our husbands, about who has custody of children in case of a divorce. All these questions are far more important for us. We want to be full participants in the community, the Muslim community in India. So they are basically saying, forget it, this talk is all a waste of time. And they are saying this tremendous focus on the hijab as it's happening in France and now in Canada is in fact only making lives of Muslim women even more difficult, because there's resistance against these things. So who is the one who will be pushed back into the house? It's women. So sometimes, you know, our understanding, that's why I said there are many feminisms, because our understanding of liberation is too limited. And when I was working in the World Council of Churches, I had letters from women saying, in Saudi Arabia, women are being forced back into hijabs. What is the World Council of Churches doing about it? And I've written back and said nothing. Because I do not want to take it on myself to believe that I can liberate another group of women. It's their liberation, and they know how to fight for their liberation. Every woman in this world wants to live a free and liberated life. There's nobody who wants to be cowed down and destroyed as they are being done. So why don't we have faith in that? Why do we assume we know what is good for them? And to think that if one of the Muslim women in India, she told me, so if I take off my hijab, am I liberated? Am I a liberated woman? So that's, see how limited we have made it. And there were 2 cases. There was a national exam for medicine, entrance exam for medicine, held in Delhi. A young Muslim woman refused to take off her hijab because that was one of the requirements, that she cannot wear a hijab to go in for the exam. And the understanding being she must have hidden her notes under her dress. And she said, you can even ask someone to come and check me, but I refuse to take it off. That is part of my dress, and you cannot tell me to remove it. At the same time, at the same exam, held in another center in Kerala, a Catholic sister was told that she cannot wear the wimple into the exam. And she said, I refuse. That's part of my dress, and I will not remove it. So you see, all of us as women face some forms of these things, and that we focus all our attention on Muslim women, and we think that by fighting just the use of the hijab, that we're going to save Muslim women from Muslim men, is the biggest mistake that we could make. We are only pushing them further backwards.
But not only that are we pushing them backwards, we then are being lumped into, or we are in the Western camp. There's a lot of attacks on us progressive Muslims, for example, that we are a tool of the US government because of our egalitarian interpretations of Islam, or that we're promoting a Western agenda for LGBTQ rights and so on and so forth. But the thing is, for us it's easy to argue back, but it's very key that the way we frame our conversation is in the context of the society from which we are working in. And for us, as myself in particular, as a Western-based NGO, not to be the one to dictate what needs to happen on the ground. We support what our grassroots organizations are doing in Burundi and what have you, but it's for them to tell us what sort of help they need and how we can assist them in their own programming that they have designed. This is very key. They need to own it, and we need to support them.
Linda, another question.
How would you suggest we support the women in Quebec that choose to wear a hijab and now cannot even get on a public bus by law?
Oh.
stand up and protest. I'm sorry.
The protests are already starting.
Yeah.
Today I saw reports on CBC of people wearing face scarves, people wearing medical masks, people wearing big dark sunglasses. Even one bus driver himself, I think I heard, covered his face as a way of saying, and he's the employee of the government driving the bus. So it'll be interesting to see how that develops now that the law has been passed. But people are already starting to stand up against it, which is encouraging.
If it's such a patriarchal message coming from the pulpit, are we not then sharing the message of our inclusion by saying we want you to be willing to be a part of face-to-face and face-to-face contact, which is sort of a different aspect of being over here in Canada versus back in a place where clearly when you say that it's an interpretation, and I guess I struggle a little bit with the interpretation being so prominent over there, and perhaps we're not as eager to say, please clothe yourself in a way that distorts our wonderful opportunity of face-to-face communication.
Okay, yes. So I will share this with you. The niqab is absolutely has no basis in Islam. Okay, there's no ifs and buts about it. Even the Orthodox Sunni institution Al-Azhar University out of Cairo, which is a 1,000-year-old institution, made the decision, I think some years ago, that because niqab started becoming popular, that this is not an Islamic attire. And that's why in Mecca you don't cover your face. That's why in Egypt and many other countries niqab is forbidden, it's banned. So the other interesting, there's a secondary sacred text in Islam, and it's called Hadith, and it's basically a collection of writings written and compiled 200 years after Prophet Muhammad died that claims what he said and what he did. Most of it is awful, but there are some beautiful ones. But there's one hadith that basically said that, you know, the smile is a form of face-to-face communication. The smile is charity. The smile is your contribution to humanity, right? So the covering of niqab is problematic in that regard as well. I completely agree. This is a conflict in the Western society where, you know, you are rooted in democracy and liberation and the right to self-determination, all that good stuff, which we all want, but how far do we let that go? How far do we let that kite fly? In the Muslim world, it's easy because it's an oppressive society. No niqab, you're banned, you can't go to university. It's as simple as that. But I think because Muslim societies can do that because they're Muslim, there is less of a backlash. If a Western society was going to do that like France did, the backlash they got was incredible. But what they did was no different than Egypt. So there's prejudice against Western societies, Western member states and countries that impose this niqab law, for example. You know, so it's a difficult one. It's a difficult one for me. But I will say this about myself. If you want to wear the niqab because it's your women's rights in the West to wear it, as a secular context, in the secular context, I defend your right to do so. If you want to go naked, then I defend your right to do so. But if you're going to use a religious excuse to do that, that's where I will fight you. That's where I draw. That's the difference.
How much of the niqab came out of desert culture where the wind blows and the sand hurts?
It absolutely does. I mean, even the men covered their face. Even the men covered their face. The Bedouins, they covered their face. Yeah.
So back in the very back, we had a question. Yeah.
Yeah, I actually now have two questions. One of them is very quick. I've actually come to Quebec, and I would like to protest this law. To what degree would it be appropriate or inappropriate for a non-Muslim woman to wear a headscarf in protest? Would it be better to go with the medical masks, like you were saying, or something like that?
I personally, not organization, I'm speaking as an individual, I would say if you want to protest the law, that is your right to do so, but I would ask you not to don the hijab or the niqab, because you are promoting then an idea that we do find oppressive in the Muslim world. So that's where I would draw the line.
Okay, thank you. My actual question is on a completely different topic. One of the big issues in feminism right now has to do with trans women and the idea that gender is non-binary. And I was just wondering to what extent you both encounter these issues in your work and how your two faiths interact with the idea that gender is non-binary or fluid.
Yeah. You know, in India we have a very interesting situation because transgendered people in Indian society and in Indian culture are considered to be normal. It is in fact, they're supposed to be special and bring blessings. Now this is in theory, but unfortunately what happens in practice is that we have high rates of violence against transgendered men and women, and that people are killed, they are begging on the streets because they have no one gives them jobs. So there's a huge campaign and struggle going on to bring changes in the laws and to accept them fully into the society. India may be one of the few countries in the world where in all official government applications, it says men, woman, or other. So you can sign as an other, and according to law, you're supposed to be given special privileges. But unfortunately, what happens in practice is that it works against you. So now there's a whole movement to try to change it. But I myself, I work with a community of transgendered women who are now from the churches, interestingly, we are thinking of how we can bring feminists across the board together. And transgendered women are part of our movement to work with us as women, not as transgendered women. And there I have a struggle because they would like to keep on talking about the transgendered women's rights. And I say, no, let's talk about women's rights in the country. And yeah, we are going on with the struggle on that. But that they are very much and should be a part of all our movements. I don't think we should treat them as if they're a special case and keep them apart. But for us in India, the issue is not transgendered people because that's an accepted way of life. What is more difficult to talk about is gays and lesbians. And the moment you talk to transgendered women about that, they say, but you know, their struggles are so different from ours. We are so obviously present everywhere and we're ill-treated by people. But we are very, very bad on the rights of gays and lesbians. And in fact, it is even in the church. We have welcoming congregations of transgendered people, but nobody wants to talk about homosexuality as an issue. I am going back, this month itself, I am part of a group working with the National Council of Churches in India, where we're trying to bring out sort of a small study book for congregations on how we can become welcoming congregations and to recognize transgender people. And I am pushing them to include the rights of gays and lesbians and not to separate them and, you know, only talk about what is the government accepts. And that seems safer than talking about gay marriage, gay love, which is banned in India. It is illegal in India. And so we have to fight against that.
Okay, so as a Muslims for Progressive Values, one of our 10 principles is LGBTQI inclusion. So we've always been a welcoming and affirming community of LGBTQI rights. But not only that, but we've been very upfront and very, we've been an advocate of LGBT rights for more than 10 years. So in Pakistan, they also have a box for trans. In Malaysia, for example, 25 years ago, the society was much more liberal than it is now. You would see trans people or gay men on television, it's not a problem. Now LGBT Muslims are ostracized, are demonized. It's really shocking how homophobic they've become, the society has become in 25 years. And a lot of this has to do with the influence of Saudi Arabia on the Muslim world in general, and also Muslim communities in the West as well. So in our community, the fact that we don't segregate, we enable trans people to stand wherever they want. See, that's the beauty of it, right? Where would a trans person stand in a traditional mosque? As a matter of fact, there was a case in Arizona where this trans man was actually arguing had a case against the mosque in Arizona for actually disclosing his medical records against his will, and so on and so forth. So, in Malaysia, for example, there's no protection. As a matter of fact, the Prime Minister of Malaysia a year and a half ago went back on the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, saying that, yeah, we support human rights, but LGBT rights. But all that started happening when the United States Supreme Court passed marriage equality. When that happened, it's like the whole Muslim world went upside down against LGBT rights, which is really very strange. But the positive thing is that in the West, in the United States, 52% of American Muslims believe in LGBT rights. So that has shifted in the last 10 years for sure. In Indonesia, there's actually a madrasah, or what they call pesantren, which is a boarding school. And there are thousands of these boarding schools going back more than 100 years of Indonesian Islam, Nusantara Islam. But there's also a boarding school for trans Muslims. Not just Muslims, but just for trans people, but that includes Muslims and non-Muslims. So it's a safe school, boarding school for trans. And now they're in the process of opening up a boarding school for LGBT Muslims as well. And they already have 70 students in the waiting list. But this is a religious institution. This is the beauty. So these are things, these beautiful stories out there, gems that you would never hear in the media. But those are the stories that keep me going, that makes me want to get up and do the work that I do, because that's really what's happening in society. Society is changing for themselves, for the better. And then I think that what we have been, one last note on LGBT. When we do our advocacy at the United Nations on LGBT rights against much of the Muslim majority countries who are very homophobic and very oppressive and violent against LGBT people, they always say to us, oh, you're just propagating an American agenda. But it's easy for us to go back and say, hang on a second, you are not discriminating. You had no discriminating laws in the books prior to colonization, did you? And they can't say anything to that, because our Muslim history, our Islamic history is rife with contributions of LGBT people, and positively and negatively. And so the fact that it's in the history books, that's something that we can always go back to pre-colonization and point to say, no, you're the one that's propagating this colonist agenda. We, the West, the Christians have moved past this hate, this version of their Christianity. They've been embracing of LGBT and sexual minority rights, and you're stuck with that. You're the one that is sticking to that old Christian values. That's not us, that's you. So it's really easy to call them out on it. I rest my case.
Well, cases being rested, we're drawing near to the end of our time. I'm wondering if there's anything else you'd like to leave us with. Is there one more? Oh, we'll have time. We'll have time for one more question. I should also, before I take the last question here, we have some coffee and some snacks out in the lobby, so there'll be time to hang out. And come meet Aruna and Ani. But we only have 4 more minutes left in this room. So I have time for one more question. So the hand I saw right up here. Yeah.
My question is for Ani. You were saying that for your personal experience that you had to relearn your faith after 9/11. Can you just elaborate on that and what you meant by that?
Okay, sure. So when these terrorists did what they did, you know, the Twin Towers and all that, and they did in the name of Islam, and they called it jihad. I'm like, what the hell is that? Because that was not the Islam that I was raised on. And I had to reassess Islam for myself, because like I said, I felt that, okay, I have to come out of the closet. And for me to come out of the closet, I knew I was going to be asked some really hard questions. And so I therefore needed to be prepared for that. I didn't want to be the fool. So what kind of Muslim are you? You don't know the answers to these questions, right? So I spent about 2.5 years, 3 years relearning Islam for myself, reading the Quran, reading books, and there's a book that I would really like to recommend to everyone, regardless whether you're Muslim, Christian, what have you, whether you believe in feminism or not. It's a book by Fatima Mernissi, Mernissi, and it's called The Veil and the Male Elite. That is one book that unshackled me from misogyny once and for all. I remember that unshackling moment, and I really recommend it to you as a young woman. And so there are lots of books by Muslim scholars and what have you on liberation theology. It was pure. It was a pure intent. And what I found was I fell in love with the social justice roots of the Quran, and so that's why I am still a Muslim.
Aruna, did you want to make a final comment, maybe about your experience of sort of rediscovering your faith through feminism and alongside feminism? And this will be our closing comment.
Well, yeah, I think Christianity is a great religion, and we have a really amazing leader of our faith who has a message for all of us, who has a message for all of us on how we live, and not talk about life after death, but how we live here and now, and how do we bring change, and how do we express solidarity. So that's what I discovered in the Bible and in stories and in the feminist theology and what women are writing. And I think that it has convinced me that there is so much feminism has to offer. And we need a new language. We need a new political language, because we see the mess the world is in everywhere. And they've tried everything under the sun, these men. So now, let us as men and women create a new world, and create where there is compassion, love, justice, the cornerstones of that, and not profit and what you do to stand on the person to get to the top. So let's work out a new language and commitment to bring change in the world. And I see it in feminism. Thank you.
Thank you both for coming in.